Chapter 6. Erlend was held prisoner in the castle till nigh upon Clement's Mass. Then there came word and letters ordering that he should be taken south, under safe conduct, to be brought before King Magnus. The king purposed to hold the Yuletide feast at Bargahus that year. Kristen was thrown into deadly fear. With unspeakable struggles she had used herself to keep calm, with Erlend a prisoner under doom of death. Now he was to be taken far away to a doubtful fate. Folk said all manner of things about the king, and in the band of men who were about him Erlend had no friends. Ivar Ogmundsson, who was now governor of the castle at Bargahus, had spoken of Erlend's treason in the harshest words, and 'twas said he had been set against Erlend the more by being told of some malapert speech of Erlend's about him in former days. But Erlend was glad of the tidings. Kristen saw indeed that he didn't take the parting now at hand lightly, but this long imprisonment had begun to wear so upon him that he grasped eagerly at the thought of the long sea journey, and seemed careless well nigh of everything else. In 3 days all was ready, and Erlend set sail in Sir Finn's ship. Simon had promised to come back to Nidaros before Advent, when he had cast about a little and ordered his affairs at home. But if before that there were any new tidings, he had prayed Kristen to send him word, and he would come at once. Now it came to her that she would journey south to him, and from thence would go on to where the king was, and would fall at his feet and pray for mercy for her husband. Gladly would she offer all her possessions to redeem his life. Erlend had sold or pledged his mansion in Nidaros to various people. The Nidarholm cloister owned the hall house now, but Abbot Olaf had written lovingly to Kristen, praying her to use it as long as she had need. She was there alone with one serving maid, Ulf Haldarsson, who had been set free since they had not enough proof against him, and his nephew Haldor, Kristen's own man. She took counsel with Ulf, and at first he showed himself somewhat doubtful. He thought it would be too hard a journey for her across the Dovrefjell. Much snow had fallen in the hills already. But when he saw the woman's anguish of soul, he turned round and counselled that she should go. Lady Gunnar took the 2 little children out to Rasvold, but Gaut would not be parted from his mother, and she felt too that she dared not let the boys stay north of Dovre and out of her sight. They met such hard weather when they came south onto the high mountains that by Ulf's counsel they borrowed ski at Drifstuen and left their horses behind there, lest they should be forced to pass the next night in the open. Kristen had not had ski on her feet since she was a little maid, and it was hard for her to make headway on them, though the men upheld and helped her to the utmost. They could come no further that day than midway in the hills between Drifstuen and Jøtkin, and when it grew dark they had to seek shelter in a birchwood and dig themselves down into the snow. At Toftar they were able to hire horses again. Here they plunged into mists, and when they came a little down into the dale they found rainy weather. When, some hours after dark had fallen, they rode into the Formo courtyard, the wind howled about the house corners, the river roared, and a rushing, sighing sound came from the hillside woods. The courtyard was like a swamp, and deadened the sound of the horses' hoofs. In the Saturday evening holiday from work there was no sign of life on the great manor, and neither the folk nor the dogs seemed to be aware of their coming. Ulf thundered on the door of the hall house with his spear. A serving man came and opened. A moment after, Simon himself stood in the outer room door, broad and dark against the light behind, with the child on his arm. He drove the barking dogs behind him. He gave a cry when he saw his wife's sister, set down the child, and drew her and Gout in, taking off their soaking outer garments himself. It was goodly and warm in the hall, but the air was very thick, for it was a fireplace room with flat ceiling under the upper hall, and 'twas full of folk, and children and dogs seemed swarming out of every corner. Then Kristen made out her 2 little sons' faces, red, warm and joyous, in behind the table where a candle stood burning. They came forward now and greeted their mother and brother a little shyly. Kristen saw that she had broken in here into the midst of these good folks' comfort and cheer. For the rest, the whole room was in a litter, and each step she took she trod on crunching nutshells. They were scattered all over the floor. Simon sent the serving men and women out on various errands, and the most part of the dogs and children followed them, as well as the grown folks. These were neighbours with their following. While he questioned and listened to her, he fastened up his shirt and coat, which had stood open, showing his naked hairy chest. The children had made him in this plight, he said in excuse. He was indeed in sad disarray. His belt was twisted awry, his hands and clothes dirty, his face sooty, and his hair full of dust and straw. Soon after came 2 serving women and brought Kristen and Gout over to Ramborg's ladies' hall. A fire had been lit there, and busy serving maids lighted candles, made up the bed, and helped her and the boy into dry clothes, while others set the board with meat and drink. A half-grown maid with silk-bound plaits brought Kristen a foaming mug of ale. The girl was Simon's eldest daughter, Unjerd. Then he himself came in. He had made himself trim and was more as Kristen was used to see him, well and richly clad. He led his little daughter by the hand, and Ivar and Skule came with him. Kristen asked after her sister, and Simon said Ramborg had gone with the ladies from Sundbu down to Ringheim. Jostein had come to fetch his daughter Helga, and he had wished to take Dagny and Ramborg with him too. He was a cheerful, kindly old man, and he had promised to take the best care of the 3 young wives. So maybe Ramborg would stay there through the winter. She looked to have another child at St. Matthew's Mass or thereabouts, and then Simon had thought 'twas like he might have to be away from home this winter, so she would be better off with her young kinswoman. No, for the housekeeping here at Formo it made no odds whether she were at home or away, laughed Simon. For he had never craved of a young child like Ramborg that she should wear herself out with the drudgery of a great household. On hearing Kristen's plans, Simon said at once that he would go south with her. He had so many kinsfolk there and so many old friends of his father's and his own that he hoped he could be of more service to her there than in Trondheim. Whether it would be wise for her to seek the king herself, he could better judge when they came thither. He would be ready for the road in 3 or 4 days. They went together to Mass the next day, being Sunday, and afterward they went to see Sira Eirik at Romengard. The priest was old now. He welcomed Kristin lovingly and seemed most sorrowful at her mischance. Then they went round by Jorengard. The houses were the same, and in the rooms were the same beds and benches and tables. This was now her own manor, and it seemed most like that 'twas here her sons would grow up, and that here she herself would one day lay herself down and close her eyes forever. But never had she felt so clearly as in this hour that it was on her father and mother all the life of this home had rested. Whatever hidden troubles they might have had to struggle with, warmth and help, peace and safety had flowed out from them to all that lived about them. Restless and heavy of heart as she was, it wearied her a little when Simon talked of his own affairs, his estates and the children. She saw herself that there was no reason in it. He was ready to help her with all his might. She saw that it was most good of him to be willing to leave his home at Yuletide, and to be parted from his wife at a time like this. He surely was thinking much on whether he would soon have a son now. For he had had only the one child by Ramborg as yet, though they would soon have been wedded 6 years. She could not hope that he should take her mischance and Erlend so much to heart as quite to forget all joy in his own happy lot. But it was strange to go about with him here and see him so joyful and warm and secure in his own home. Unwittingly, Kristen had thought that Ulfhild Simonsdatter would be like her own little sister, whom she had been named after. She would be fair-haired and slender and clear-skinned. But Simon's little daughter was round and fat, with cheeks like apples and a mouth like a red berry, quick grey eyes like her father's in his youth, and with his goodly brown curly hair. Simon loved the bonny, lively child much, and was proud of her quick-witted prattle. "Though yet this little girl is so ugly and loathly and ill-favoured," he said, putting his hands on each side of her chest and twirling her while he lifted her into the air, "I think 'tis a changeling that the trolls up in the fell have brought here for her mother and me to put into the cradle. Such a grim and grum little thing she is." Then he set her down suddenly and hastily, and made the sign of the cross over her 3 times, as though frighted by his own rash words. His base-born daughter, Arnjerd, was not fair, but she looked good and understanding, and her father took her about with him as often as it was possible. He was full of praises of her handiness. Kristen was made to look into Arnjerd's chest and see all the things she had spun and woven and sewed already for her dowry. "The day I lay the hand of this daughter of mine in a good, true-hearted bridegroom's hand," said Simon, looking long after the girl, "it will be one of the gladdest days I have known." To save the cost and to get the journey over quickly, Kristen would not take with her any maid, nor any man other than Ulf Haldarsson. 14 days before Yule, then, she and he set forth from Formo, in company with Simon and his 2 stout young serving men. When they came to Oslo, Simon soon learnt that the king would not come to Norway. He was to hold the Yuletide feast at Stockholm, it seemed. Erlend was in the castle at Akersness. The governor of the castle was away, so that in the meantime it was not possible for any of them to see the prisoner. But the under-treasurer, Olaf Koning, promised to let Erlend know they were in the city. Olaf showed much friendliness towards Simon and Kristen, for his brother was wedded to Ramborg Asmundsdatter of Skog, so that he counted him a far-off kinsman of Lavran's daughters. Ketil of Skog came into the city and bade them out to Skog to drink Yuletide with him, but Kristen would not keep the holy days with feasting while things stood thus with Erlend, and Simon would not go alone, though she prayed him much to do so. Simon and Ketil knew somewhat of each other, but Kristen had seen her uncle's son but once since he was grown up. Kristen and Simon took lodging in the same mansion where she had once been his parents' guest when they 2 were betrothed, but they dwelt in another house. There were 2 beds in the room. She slept in one, and Simon and Ulf in the other. The men lay in the stable. On Christmas Eve, Kristen wished to go to the midnight mass in Nonneseter church. She said it was because the sisters sang so sweetly. So they, all 5, went together. The night was clear starlight, mild and fair, and it had snowed a little in the evening so that it was somewhat light. When the bells began ringing from the churches, folk streamed out of all the houses, and Simon had to lead Kristen by the hand. Now and then he stole a glance at her. She was grown greatly thinner this last autumn, but it was as though her tall, straight form had got back something of the young maid's supple and tranquil grace. Over her pale face there was come again the look she had had in youth, of calm and gentleness, covering a deep and hidden, listening expectancy. She had taken on a strange, ghostly likeness to the young Kristen of that Yuletide long ago. Simon pressed her hand, and knew not that he had done so till he felt an answering pressure. He looked up. She smiled and nodded, and he understood that she had taken his hand-clasp as a warning to her to be brave. And now she was striving to show him that indeed she was brave. Toward the end of the holy days, Sir Munin came to her. He had only now heard she was in the city, he said. He greeted her heartily, likewise Simon Anderson and Ulf, whom he spoke to at every second word as kinsman and dear friend. It might be hard for them to gain sight of Erlend, he said. He was most strictly guarded. He had not been able to get in to see his cousin, but Ulf said with a laugh when the night was gone that he thought not Munin had pressed so exceeding hard to gain entrance. He was in such deadly fear of being tangled in the affair that he could scarcely bear to hear it named. Munin had grown exceeding old, exceeding bald and wasted in flesh. The skin hung loose on his bulky frame. He dwelt out at Skogheim and had with him one of his base-born daughters, who was a widow. The father would have gladly been quit of her, for none of his other children, neither those born in wedlock nor the others, would come near him so long as this half-sister ruled his house. She was an overbearing, greedy and shrewish woman, but Munin dared not bid her begone. At length, some time on in the new year, Olaf Koenig got leave for Erlend's wife and Simon to see him. And now again it fell to Simon's lot to bear the sorrowful wife company at these heart-breaking meetings. Much stricter watch was kept here than at Nidaros, to see that Erlend spoke with no one except the governor's folk were nearby. Erlend was calm as before, but Simon saw that this waiting was beginning to wear upon the man. He made no complaint at any time and said that he suffered no ill usage, and that all was done for him that could be done. But he agreed that he was much plagued with the cold. There was no fireplace in the cell, and 'twas not in his power to indulge himself overmuch in cleanliness. Though, he laughed, had he not had the lice to fight with, like enough the time would have seemed yet longer out here. Kristen too was calm. So calm indeed that Simon waited in breathless fear for the day when she should break down altogether. King Magnus made his royal progress in Sweden, and there seemed no likelihood that he would cross the boundary soon, or that any change in Erlend's state was at hand. On the day of Gregory's Mass, Kristen and Ulf Haldarsson had been at church at Nonneseter. When, on their way back, they had crossed the bridge over the Nonnebeck, she didn't take the way down towards her lodging, which lay near the bishop's palace, but turned eastward toward the open place by Clement's church, and into the narrow lanes between the church and the river. The day was grey and thick. There had been soft weather for a time, and their footwear and the skirts of their cloaks quickly grew wet and heavy with the yellow clay of the riverside. They came out on the open lands toward the high bank of the river. Once their eyes met. Ulf laughed noiselessly, and his mouth twisted into a sort of grimace, but his eyes were sorrowful. Kristen smiled, a strange, sick smile. Soon after they stood at the edge of the high ground. There had once been a landslip in the clay bank here, and Pfluger's house lay right under it, so close up against the dirty yellow slope that the stench of the pigsty, which they looked down on, came rankly up to them. 2 fat sows were snuffling about in the black mud. The river bank was but a narrow strip here. The muddy grey river current, with the jostling ice flakes on it, came right up to the tumble-down houses with their bleached grey shingle roofs. While they stood there, a man and a woman came up to the fencing of the sty and looked at the pigs. The man leaned over and began scratching one of the sows with the shaft end of the silver-mounted light axe he was using as a staff. It was Munin Bardson himself, and the woman was Brynhild. He looked up and was ware of them. He stood gaping up at them, and Kristen called out a cheerful greeting. Sir Munin began to laugh loudly. "Come down and have a drink of warm ale to keep out this filthy weather," he called up. As they went down to the gates of the houses, Ulf told Kristen that Brynhild Jonsdatter kept neither lodging-house nor ale-tap any more. She had been in trouble many times, and at last had been threatened with flogging, but Munin had got her out, and gone surety for her that she would altogether cease her unlawful traffickings. Her sons, too, had now got so far on in the world that for their sake their mother was forced to think of bettering her ill repute. After his wife's death, Munin Bardson had taken up with her again, and he was often to be found in her house. He met them at the gate. "Here we are, kinsfolk, all 4 of us in a fashion," he snickered. He was a little on in drink, but not much. You are a good woman, Kristin Lavransdatter, pious but not proud. Brynhild, too, is an honourable, worshipful woman now, and I was not yet a wedded man when I got the 2 sons I have by her, and they are much the best of all my children. I have told you as much every day in these years, Brynhild. Inga and Goodleik are dearest to me of all my children. Brynhild was comely still, but her skin was a pale yellow, and looked as if it must feel clammy, Kristen thought, as when one has stood all day over the fat cauldrons. But her house was well kept. The food and drink that she put on the board were of the best, and the vessels fair and clean. I look in here when I have an errand in Oslo, said Munin. You understand the mother is fain to hear tidings of her sons. Inge writes to me from time to time, for he is a learned man, Inge. A bishop's commissary must be so, you know. And I got him well wedded, too, with Tora Bjarnsdatter of Groth. Do you think many men have got such a wife for their bastard? So we sit here and talk about this, and Brynhild bears in the meat and ale to me, just as she used to in days gone by, when she bore the keys of my house at Skogheim. 'Tis heavy work sitting out there now, thinking of my wife that is gone. So I ride in here to find a little comfort, when it chances that Brynhild is in such a mood that she grudges me not a little friendliness and comfort. Ulf Haldarsson sat with his chin resting on his hand, looking at the Lady of Huseby. Kristen sat and listened, and answered quietly and gently and mannerly, as calm and courtly as if she had been a guest at one of the great folks' manors at home in Trondheim. "Aye, you, Kristin Lavransdatter, you won a wife's name and came to honour," said Brynhild Fluga, "though you came willingly enough to meet Erlend in my loft. I have been called slut and loose woman all my days. My stepmother sold me into his hands, that man here, Munin. I bit and scratched and left the marks of every one of my nails on his face before he had his will of me." "Must you speak of this all the time?" grumbled Munin. "Be sure I have told it you so often too. I had let you go in peace had you borne you like a human creature and bidden me spare you. But you flew at my face like a wildcat before I was well inside the door." Ulf Haldarsson laughed softly to himself. "And I dealt well by you evermore thereafter," said Munin. "You had but to point to a thing and I gave it to you. And our children, for sure they are better off and safer this day than Kristin's poor sons. God guard the poor young lads, so as Erlend has guided things for his children. I think that should mean more than the name of wife to a mother's heart. And you know that I wished often your birth had been such that I could have wedded you lawfully. No woman have I liked as well as you, though you were but seldom kind or good to me. And the wife I did get, God reward her. I have set up an altar for my Katrin and myself in our church at home, Kristen. I have thanked God and Our Lady every day for my wedded life. No man has had a better." He whimpered and sniffed. Soon after, Ulf Haldarsson said that they must go. He and Kristen exchanged not a word on the way back, but outside the door she reached out her hand to the man. "Ulf, my kinsman and my friend." "If it could help at all," he said in a low voice, "I would gladly go to the gallows in Erlend's stead, for his sake and for yours." That evening, a little before bedtime, Kristen sat alone in the hall with Simon. Of a sudden she began telling him where she had been that day. She told of the meeting at Brynhild Fluga's. Simon sat on a stool not far from her, leaning forward a little with his arms resting on his thighs and hands hanging down. He sat looking up at her with a strange, searching look in his small, sharp eyes. He spoke not a word, and not a muscle moved in his big, heavy face. Then she let fall that she had told everything to her father, and what he had said to her. Simon sat as before, immovable. But in a while he said calmly, "That was the only thing I ever prayed of you in all the years we had known each other. If I remember correctly, that you would not speak of it. But if you could not keep silent to spare Lavrans, why—" Kristen's whole body trembled. But Erlend! At the wild cry the man leaped up. Kristen had thrown herself forward, with her head between her arms, and was rocking her body from side to side, still calling on Erlend between quivering, moaning sobs that seemed to tear their way out of her body. "Kristen, in Jesus' name!" When he seized her upper arm and tried to stop her sobbing, she flung herself on him with all the weight of her body and caught him around the neck, while through her weeping she went on calling her husband's name. "Kristen, be still!" He held her tight in his arms and saw that she didn't know it. She was weeping so that she could not stand upright. Then he lifted her up in his arms, crushed her to him a moment, and then bore her over and laid her on the bed. "Be still," he prayed her again in a choking, almost a threatening voice. He laid his hands over her face, and she caught his wrists and arms and clung close to him. "Simon! Simon! Oh, he must be saved!" "I do what I can, Kristen, but now you shall be still." He turned sharply, walked over to the door and out into the yard. He shouted till the echoes rang back from the house walls for the maid whom Kristen had hired in Oslo. The girl came running, and Simon bade her go into her mistress. In a moment she came out again. Her mistress would be alone, she said to Simon, who still stood on the same spot. He nodded and walked over to the stables. He stayed there till Gunnar, his man, and Ulf Haldarsson came to give the beasts their evening feed. Simon talked with them a while, then went with Ulf back to the hall. Kristen didn't see much of her brother-in-law the next day, but about the middle of the afternoon, as she sat sewing on a garment she meant to take out to her husband, he came running in, said nothing to her, didn't look at her, but flung open the lid of his travelling chest, filled his silver goblet with wine, and rushed out again. Kristen stood up and went after him. Before the door of the hall stood a strange man, still holding his horse. Simon drew a gold ring from his finger, dropped it into the goblet, and drank to the newcomer. Kristen guessed what this must be, and cried out joyfully, "You have a son, Simon!" "Ah, yes!" He slapped the messenger on the shoulder, as the man, thanking him, put up the goblet and the ring safely inside his belt. Then Simon caught his wife's sister around the waist and whirled her round and round. He looked so glad that Kristen could only put her 2 hands on his shoulders, and then he kissed her full on the mouth and laughed aloud. "Then 'twill still be dar stock that will hold Formo when you are gone, Simon," she said joyfully. "Ah, yes, so it will be, if God wills." "No, tonight I would go alone," he said, when Kristen asked if they should go together to evensong. That night he said to Kristen that he had heard Sir Erling Vidkundsen was now at his manor of Acre near Tunsberg, and that morning he had hired him a passage in a ship going down the fjord. He was minded to speak with Sir Erling of Erlend's case. Kristen didn't say much in answer. They had scarcely mentioned the obvious question here, whether Sir Erling had been privy to Erlend's plans or not. Simon said now it would be well that he should ask Erling Vidkundsen's counsel as to Kristen's plan that Simon should go with her to Lavran's powerful kinsfolk in Sweden, to claim kinship and crave their help. Then Kristen spoke her thought. "But now you have these great tidings, brother-in-law, I think that you should put off this journey to Acre, and first ride up to Ringheim and see to Ramborg and your son." He was forced to turn away, so overcome was he. He had waited so for this. Whether Kristen would make any sign that she understood how he longed to see his son. But when he had mastered himself somewhat, he said with some shyness in his voice, I have been thinking, Kristen. Perhaps God will vouchsafe that the boy thrive and prosper the better, if I can be patient and hold in check my longing to see him till I have managed to help you and Erlend a little forward in this matter. The day after he went out and bought rich and costly gifts for his wife and the boy, and for all the women too who had been with Ramborg when she bore the child. Kristen took out a fair silver spoon she had had from her mother's heritage. It was to be for Andres Simonsen. To her sister she sent the heavy silver gilt chain that Lavrans had given her in her childhood, along with the reliquary cross. The cross she fastened now to the chain Erlend had given her as a betrothal gift. The next day at midday Simon sailed. In the evening the ship lay to under an island in the fjord. Simon stayed on board. He lay in a sleeping bag of hide, with some pieces of wadmal over him, looking up at the starry skies, where the constellation seemed to climb and dive again, as the boat pitched on the sleepily gliding swell. The water splashed, and the ice flakes scraped and thumped softly against the vessel's sides. It was almost comforting to feel the cold creeping farther and farther through his body. It deadened everything. Yet now he was sure. So bad as things had been with him, they could never be so again, now that he had a son. It was not that he thought he could be fonder of the boy than he was of his daughters. It was something else. For all the heart's gladness that his little maids could give him when they sought their father with their games and laughter and prattle, sweet as it was to hold them in his lap and feel their soft hair against his chin, yet in this way a man could never take his place in the succession of the men of his house, if his lands and goods and the memory of his doings in the world must pass with the daughter's hand over into a strange kindred. But now, when he might hope, if God would but grant that his little son should grow to manhood, that a foremost son should come after father, Andres Gudmundsson, Simon Andresen, Andres Simonsen. Now it must surely follow of itself that he must stand before Andres as his father had stood before himself, an honest man in his secret thoughts no less than in his open acts. Sometimes things had been so that he didn't understand how he could bear it any longer. If only he had seen but one token that she understood. But Kristen behaved to him as though they were brother and sister, careful for his well-being, kind and loving and gentle. And he didn't know how long this would last, how long they could live together in this way in one house. Did the thought never come to her that he could not forget, that even though he was wedded with her sister, he could never quite forget that they too had been meant once to live together in wedlock? But now he had this son. He had always been ashamed to add in his own words anything of his wishes or his thanks when he said over his prayers. But he thought that Christ and Mary Virgin knew well what it had meant when he had said double number of paternosters and aves each day in these last days. And he would keep on with this so long as he was away from home. And in other ways too he would show his thankfulness in fitting and open-handed fashion. And thus, maybe, he would win help on this present journey too. Though, indeed, he thought himself there was little reason to look for much from this visit. Sir Erling was quite estranged now from the king, and however powerful and secure the former regent of the realm might be, and however little he needed to fear the young king, who was much more ticklishly placed than was he, the richest and most high-born man in Norway, yet it could not be expected that he should be willing to anger King Magnus yet more against himself by pleading Erlend Nikolausson's cause and bringing suspicion on himself of having been privy to Erlend's treason, even if he had had a part in it. Aye, even if he had been at the bottom of the whole plan, ready to step in, and have himself placed at the head of affairs the moment a minor king was once more upon the throne, he would scarce feel himself bound to venture anything to help the man who had brought the whole plan to ruin, for the sake of a shameful love adventure. It was as though Simon half forgot it when he was with Erlend and Kristen, for they too seemed scarce to remember it any more. But so it was that Erlend himself had wrought the mischief. It was his doing. Nothing else had come of the whole undertaking than ruin for himself, and for the men who had been betrayed by his wantonness and folly. But he must do anything he could to help her and her husband. And now he began to hope. For perhaps God and Mary Virgin, or some of the saints whom he used to honour with offerings and almsgivings, would vouchsafe their aid in this as well. He came to Acre somewhat late in the evening. A steward met him and sent off men, some with the horses, some with Simon's man, to the serving-men's house, while Simon himself went to the loft-room, where the knight was sitting drinking. Sir Erling himself came out into the balcony straight away, and stood there while Simon mounted the stair. Then he greeted his guest courteously enough, and led him into the hall, where was Stig Håkonsson of Manvik with Erling's only son, Bjarn Erlingsson, a quite young man. He was welcomed fairly enough. The serving folk took from him his outer garments, and bore in meat and drink. But he guessed that the men guessed, at least Sir Erling and Stig, what he was come for, and he felt that they were holding back. So when Stig began saying how rarely he was to be seen in this part of the country now, how seldom he darkened the doors of his former kinsfolk, and asked if he had ever been further south than Differen since Halfrid died, Simon answered no, not before this winter. But now he had been in Oslo some months with his wife's sister, Kristin Lavransdatter, who was wed with Erlend Nicolausson. On this there was a short silence. Then Sir Erling asked courteously after Kristen and Simon's wife, and his brothers and sisters. And Simon asked after Lady Elin and Erling's daughters, and how things were with Stig, and how his old neighbours at Manvik were, and what were the tidings from there. Stig Håkonsson was a stoutly made, dark-haired man, some years older than Simon, son of Halfrid Erlingsdatter's half-brother, Sir Hakon Thorisson, and brother's son of Erling Vidkunsson's lady, Elin Thorisdatter. He had lost the wardenship of Skidoo and the governorship of the Tunsberg castles 2 winters back, when he fell out with the king, but still was well enough off with his Mandvik estates. But he was a widower and childless. Simon knew him well, and had been good friends with him, as with all his first wife's kin, even if the friendship had not been over-hot. He knew exceeding well what they had all thought of Halfrid's second marriage. Sir Andres Gudmundsson's younger son was doubtless a man of substance and of good birth, but an even match for Halfrid Erlingsdatter he was not. Besides that, he was 10 years younger. They could not understand why she had set her heart on this young man. But they must even let her do as she would, since she had suffered such unbearable misery with her first husband. Simon had met Erling Vidkundsson only a few times before, and then it had always been in Lady Elin's company, and at such times no sound ever came from him. No one needed to say more than yes or no when she was there. Sir Erling had aged a lot since that time. He was grown somewhat stouter, but his form was still comely and noble, for he bore himself exceeding fairly, and it suited him well that his pale reddish-yellow hair was now turned a shining silver-grey. The young Bjarn Erlingsson Simon had not seen before. He had been brought up near Bjorgvin in the house of a cleric, a friend of Erling's. It was said among the kindred that this was because his father would not have him live out at Gisk in the midst of a pack of foolish women. Erling himself was there no more than he needed to be, and he dared not take the boy with him on his constant journeys, for Bjarn had been weakly and ailing as a growing lad, and Erling had lost 2 other sons in their childhood. The boy looked exceeding comely as he sat with the light behind him, showing his side face. Black, tightly curling hair rolled forward over his forehead. His great eyes seemed black. His nose was large and strongly curved, the mouth full and firm and fine, and the chin well formed. And he was tall, slender, and broad-shouldered. But when Simon had to sit down to the table to eat, the serving man moved the candle, and now he saw that the skin of Bjarne's neck was quite eaten up with the scars of scrofula. They stretched on both sides, right up under the ears and forward beneath the chin, dead, dull white patches, and bluish-red stripes and swollen knots. And then Bjarne had a trick of time and again pulling up the hood of the round fur-edged velvet cape that he wore even here in the room, pulling it up halfway over his head. When, soon after, it grew too hot for him, he would turn it down, and then draw it up again. He seemed not to know that he did it. Simon felt his hands grow quite restless at length with looking at this, though he tried to keep from looking. Sir Erling scarcely took his eyes off his son, but he too seemed not to know that he was gazing so intently at the boy. Erling Vidkunsen's face was set and unchanging, and his pale blue eyes showed his feelings but little. But beneath the somewhat vague and watery glance there seemed to lie the cares and thought and love of endless years. So the 3 elder men exchanged mannerly, sluggish talk, while Simon ate, and the youth sat fiddle-faddling with his hood. Afterwards all 4 sat drinking for a space of time, and then Sir Erling asked if Simon were not weary with his journey, and Stig asked if he would be pleased to sleep with him. Simon was glad to be able to put off speaking of his errand. This first evening at Acre had left him feeling very dispirited. The next day, when he broached the matter, Sir Erling's answer was much what Simon had expected. He said that King Magnus had never hearkened to him willingly, and he had seen, from the time Magnus Eiríksson was old enough to have a will of his own, that his will had been that Erling Vidkunsen should have nothing to say in his affairs once he was of age. And since the quarrel between him and his friends on the one side and the king on the other had been made up, he had heard and tried to hear nothing of the king or the king's friends. If he pleaded Erlend's cause with King Magnus, it would scarce help the man much. He knew well enough that many in this land believed he had been in some way at the bottom of Erlend's undertaking. But whether Simon believed him or not, neither he nor his friends had known anything of what was hatching. Had this matter come to light in another way, or had these venturesome young daredevils risked their throw and failed, then he would have stepped in and striven to make their peace. But as things had gone, he didn't think that any could justly crave of him that he should come forward, and thereby strengthen all men's suspicions that he had played a double game. But he counselled Simon to have recourse to the Haftorsons. They were the king's cousins, and, when they chanced not to be at feud with him, they kept up between them a friendship of a sort. And, so far as Erling understood the matter, the men whom Erlend was shielding were rather to be found among the Haftorsons' party, and among the youngest of the nobles. Now, as Simon knew, the king was to hold his wedding in Norway this summer, and there might then be a fitting occasion for Magnus to show mildness and clemency to his enemies, and the king's mother and Lady Isabel would doubtless come to the wedding feast. Since Simon's mother had been Queen Isabel's maid of honour in her youth, Simon might turn him to Lady Isabel, or Erlend's wife might throw herself before the king's bride and Lady Ingeborg Ravnsdatter with prayers for their intercession. Simon thought that the last thing they would try would be for Kristen to kneel to Lady Ingeborg. Had the Duchess understood what honour was, she would long since have come forward and rescued Erlend from this dilemma. But when he had mentioned this once to Erlend, he had but laughed and said the lady had always so many ticklish matters of her own to see to, and doubtless she was angry, since it now seemed most unlikely that her dearest child should ever bear the name of king.